Hello, everyone. All right, it's working. Nice. Hi, everyone. Very excited for today. Gonna just wait a few more minutes, let people pop in, and start asking some questions. I have a lot of questions that have already come in. Thank you for those, and we will start in just a few minutes here. Let's make sure I can. All right, so we have 5 questions already, which is super exciting. Okay, so we'll get through those. What's the best way to do this? Hello, everyone. I see. How are you? I see some familiar faces there in the chat. Awesome to have everyone. I just have up the Daily Log app here just to make sure that it's something to look at. We have a few questions, and what I'm going to do is open up a new note, and we're going to just I'm going to document some of them. So I had one that was a monorepo or three. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about Strata breaking on redirects. That's a lot has popped up around there. I'm excited to dive into a PR that might be interesting to some folks. Um, Let's see what else we got. We had some folks asking about not the best user experience. How would you approach a maximum impact? Like maximum impact, we'll talk about how screens can become native there. Let's see. And then Cloudflare tunnel, VPNs. Oops. VPNs is another question that popped up. And then I have one more that came in, which was about QR code scanning. And then we also have from Chris here. Oh, Chris was already answered, or at least it's in the notes. We have one about. Oh, that's it. Sweet. Okay. So, all right, tons of chat popping off. This is awesome. I'm just going to take some notes here about some of the chat ones that we talked to. Roadmap for Turbo native for building apps from VUCA Rails, sorry. Is Strata independent? Strata versus Turbo native, we'll talk about. Back in August, I mentioned working on a Turbo native book, native authentication configured with devise, native auth with devise. We'll talk about that, and persisting session. All right, this is looking great, guys. I'm excited to dive into some of these, and then Turbo native Android. I started a Turbo native Android project last night, so we can definitely dive into that. Okay, I think that these 10 are a great place to start. We could spend all of the hour talking about just a single one of these, but what we'll do is I'll work through these 10, and then as more questions pop up in the chat, we can dive into those separately, because I think we can knock through a bunch of these pretty quick. So if anything is super pressing in the chat, just let me know. Otherwise, we're going to start working through these really quick. All right. First of all, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Joe Mazzolati. I blog on, where are we here? Pop that over. Mazzolati.com is where I write all of this awesome Turbo Native content. I have that weekly newsletter, which you can subscribe to. I'd love for you to check it out if you're looking to do more Turbo Native stuff or just like Hotwire and Ruby on Rails. That's a weekly that goes out with a bunch of exclusives. So, monorepo or three? This was a question that was asked, essentially asking, do I hold all of my code in a single repo, or do I have an iOS repo, an Android repo, and a Rails repo? I've done both. I've done both to success. Right now, I have one, Joe Mazzolati Daily Log. This is my open source app, which I'm actually running in the background right here, on iOS at least. And here I have the Rails code, the iOS code, and the Android code. That's empty. More about that later. All just in a single repo. This works really well for a project like this with a single developer. Everything stays in sync. I don't have to worry about different releases and all that stuff. I just push one thing and we're all live. For a larger project where you have multiple developers, it might still make sense to split this up into different repos, just so you can have your iOS team working on the iOS stuff, your Android team working on the Android stuff, and of course Rails on Rails. That said, you will have to do a lot of work in keeping everything in sync. Let's say you make a Rails change and want to deploy an iOS feature. Well, you have to make sure that those releases kind of coincide together. So I like to look at if your team is small and can manage it all in a single repo to do that. If your team is too large and like you don't want your Rails developers knowing about an iOS specific bug because they're separate, keep them separate. I know that for Turbo Native, we've kept everything separate, Android and iOS versus like Strata and Android and stuff. That is more for package management features than like code complexity. So don't use that as kind of like the truth there. That has a different perspective coming from maintainers, so to speak. Okay, cool. One down. Strata breaking on redirects. This is something that is, Marco says that CDing into the directories somehow seems annoying. I usually just pop open them like all at once. So here I have, up at the top, I have the iOS directory. So I'm in my workspace projects, my daily log Git repo, and I have this one opened up to iOS, and I have this one opened up to Rails. I just kind of keep this split working all day when I'm working in one of these apps, and it doesn't matter if it's a remote repo or multiple repos or a single repo. But that's my workflow. I like it like that. Okay, Strata breaking on redirects. This is an issue that I've seen folks come up with pretty often. If I look at the Strata iOS issues, you can see that I think that all four, with the exception of this one, but the other three are the exact same issue. When you load a Strata component on essentially your home page and it redirects, so your server redirects, the Strata component all of a sudden disconnects. I know that Miles Woodruff was talking about this for a while. There's a problem in the Strata library. The good news is that the fix is really easy. The fix is implemented in this PR. This is pull request number 24 on the Strata iOS repo, and it fixes that location change. Unfortunately, it's not merged in yet. We're running into some issues with the testing not being super friendly, so we're having a lot of failed tests, unfortunately. But we're okay with that for right now. We know that this is still in beta. I'm recommending everyone point to this branch if you're using Strata, the fix redirect issue, and you can see how that works. If I open daily log and I go to package dependencies, you can see right here that I'm pointing Turbo to the Turbo Navigator branch and Strata to the fix redirect issue branch. I think that that's like the right, Miles saying that he's using it in his app. I'm using it in daily log, as you can see here. If that, Strata iOS right here, you can just select branch and then type it in here. It's grayed out because I already have the dependency, but that's a really easy way to get that fixed. I haven't seen any downsides of it. We just need to make sure we get those tests fixed, and then we can merge it into Strata iOS. Maximum impact. This is a question that someone asked about, like what the roadmap, or not the roadmap, what the best way to build Turbo native apps to give like the highest fidelity, most bang for their buck. The way that I look at this is step one is get in the App Store. Get feature parity with your Rails app in the App Store as soon as possible. Your biggest risk is platform risk, is the fact that Apple could just essentially say to you, no, you can't have this app in the App Store for whatever reason. I mean, obviously, Hey and Basecamp and 37 Signals have been going through this now with all the drama with the Hey calendar. They had to work around some things with Apple. Maybe your team has that kind of sway. Maybe they don't. Maybe you're going to have to add push notification or in-app purchases to make the Apple review folks happy. So the first step is always get in the App Store with an MVP that works. Even if it's ugly, even if it's all web-based, know that you can get your app in the App Store and then progressively enhance your screens. The screens that I like to start with first are things like native maps, things like the home screen if you really want to go all out. But you can also get by pretty far now with just a few Strata components. Some Strata components like the form submit, the Strata component like the menu. And the best part about all of those is that we can actually get them for free pretty much. In the demo app, I'm looking at iOS right now, under Strata, we have these components already built out for us that we can copy and paste and put in our app. I use a version of this to submit a form button in Daily Log, which you can look at right here. So if I do get started, I haven't started the server, so let me just start the server. Boing. So here, if I go to the sign-in page, I have a native button right up here in the top right. That native button is from this form component, pretty much copy-pasted with a little bit of tweaking. It submits the form. As you can see here, we got some validation on the client side from our Rails server, or sorry, from our HTML, and now a password. I'm just going to say that this is bogus, obviously. I click sign in. We even get a flash message. And if you notice, it actually disabled the button. So pretty quickly, you can get something working without having to know a lot of Swift because you're kind of just copy and pasting everything. Remember that you'll need to get the web component that comes from Hotwired and then Turbo Native Demo. This is like the little JavaScript app that you get when you go to turbonativedemo.glitch.me. And here's where we have the Strata stuff. So this is where you'll find the code for the Strata components right here. So feel free to copy and paste those. MIT license, go for it. VPNs, I had a question about VPNs and kind of redirecting through different routes. I don't have direct experience on this, but I do know that if it works for your Rails server, it shouldn't have a problem on your iOS or Android app. Obviously, that's a huge hand-wavy answer, but I can't say for sure more than that other than it should work without any extra changes. If that's not the case and you can't get it working, send me an email and we will work on it together. QR code scanning is something that is really exciting because you have a bunch of different routes you can go. One approach is that you can do it all web-based and just build your entire QR code scanning experience on the web and then know that it will just work on your iOS and Android apps. It won't be the best experience, but it will work. The second approach is that you use the native iOS and native Android QR code scanners. So if I just Google Swift QR code scanning, you'll see that there's a Hacking with Swift article, and it's a bunch of ugly code, and that you can just copy and paste as well. This is a Swift UI, this is actually a scanner view controller, so you could push this onto the stack and scan a code, and then what happens is we get found code right here where they're printing it out. You now can do whatever you want with that code, such as visit the URL that was scanned or post it to your server. Obviously, this is going to require a lot more Swift or Kotlin experience, but you'll get a better experience because you can fine-tune it the way that you want. Alternatively, you can also configure the camera in a way that it will scan codes for you. I haven't done that myself, but I know that it's possible because I've seen it in other apps. So also take a look at just configuring the built-in camera. Okay, that's the first 5 questions that I got from everyone that emailed me or everyone that had reached out on Twitter. I'm going to dive into the chat now and go through some chat questions so everyone gets kind of like a fair shot here. So, first question we're going to answer from the chat up at the top, we have from VUCA Rails, it is. I think I can put user in timeout. No, I'm not going to put you in timeout. VUCA Rails asks a roadmap for developing native mobile apps. So I'm assuming that this is what they're asking is essentially like what my flow is for building out apps, like how I work on one versus the other. I pretty much follow the same flow that I do for building Rails, well, for every single app. The first step is I build some sort of MVP for my Rails app. This is to test the product. This is to make sure that the product itself is worth it. There's no point in going iOS and Android if you don't have a product that works on the web, in my opinion. If you already have a Rails app that you're trying to then like port to iOS and Android, skip this step and just move on to number 2, which is build the iOS MVP. Get approved. iOS, I find, is a lot easier to work with than Android. I have more experience in it. Your results may vary, but the point is that Apple is way more strict than Android in terms of getting approved in the App Store. So if you can get your iOS app approved, odds are that the same approach will work on Android. There are obviously exceptions, but that's how I've usually seen things play out. Third up is do the same for Android. Build the Android MVP, get approved. We're talking HTML only screens here. Nothing native unless you absolutely have to, like something like push notifications or in-app purchases. Step 4 is to finally progressively enhance. That's like native screens, that's native components, that's what is it, like SDK integrations, address books, that kind of stuff. Once you have your apps in the App Store, you can submit new versions much more easily than going through the whole rigmarole of the initial process. It's not easy, but it's still way easier than the first time you submit. And once you're in the App Store, you can start promoting it and start selling it and start doing all the stuff you would normally do before you then make the experience feel more native. I found with, almost everyone, people can't tell the difference between an HTML Turbo native app versus a native screen. Obviously, everyone in this room probably could. Everyone that's in this chat right now probably could. But you find someone on the street and you say, hey, is this a website or a native app? If it's a home screen icon, it's a native app to them. So take that with you as you build out these screens and know that if it looks good enough, this screen right here, that looks like a native screen to normal, quote, very, non-tech folk people. Hope that helped. Next question was also from VUCA Rails. Is Strata independent of Turbo Native? Or do they depend on each other? Strata is completely independent of Turbo Native. Neither has a dependency on the other. You can use Strata without Turbo Native if you want, and you can use Turbo Native without Strata, obviously. They are completely independent in that they don't have any references to each other at all. I have never worked on a Strata app that didn't have Turbo Native. I look at Strata as kind of like an additional layer on top of Turbo Native to make your app better, but you could use Strata if you wanted without Turbo Native, of course. My approach, as you saw a little bit earlier, is to add Turbo and Strata dependencies on iOS, pointing to the Turbo Navigator branch. On Android, you can point to the 7.02 release, the latest one. It already has Turbo Navigator kind of integrated. But for Strata, you still probably want to use the fixed redirect issue branch to make sure that when you redirect on the home page, you don't break any Strata component connections. Okay. Third question here is, does Turbo Native compare with other cross-platform? How does Turbo Native compare to Flutter and React Native? So I'm going to do a little list here. The pros of Turbo Native are you build web once, deploy everywhere. But the pros of Flutter are you build once, deploy everywhere. That's just Flutter actually and React Native. Or, well, let me write that a different way. In the categories of write once, deploy everywhere, the best one is Flutter, followed by Turbo Native, followed by React Native. With Flutter, the code that you write for your web app is the exact code that you write for your iOS and your Android app. Besides maybe a couple wrapping lines, you don't have to make really any changes to get that working on iOS or Android. It is the same thing that runs everywhere. Flutter is a great framework if you want to write Flutter, you want to write Dart for your entire experience. Just below that, Turbo Native is second best here because you still have to write, you're going to write your Rails app, you're going to write your web views, but you still need your native wrappers. And until you have those native wrappers on iOS and Android, your web app isn't accessible on your native platforms. But once you have those, it's almost better, I think, than Turbo Native. We're going to have another chapter down here called maintenance. Maintenance, thank you, that we'll talk about in a second. I think that React Native is the worst here for a Rails developer. And I say that because with React Native, you need to have your API and your front end. And if your front end is built with React and you already have a web API and a React front end, React Native is going to be a really good fit for you. But if you don't have a React Native front end and you only have a Rails website, you have to rebuild everything again for both platforms. You have to build an API and then your React Native app that, yes, you can deploy across both platforms, but you have to rebuild the entire thing. So for a Rails developer, Turbo Native is the best by far. But in terms of like purist, write once, deploy everywhere, you're going to get a better edge with Flutter if you're starting from scratch and want to write Dart for everything. Maintenance, I think that Turbo Native is the best. You can deploy your changes to your Rails app and not have to worry about resubmitting or repackaging or rebundling or anything. It just is live on your server. You can add new features. You can do all of this stuff that the other platforms don't really work that well with. You still have to repackage your Flutter app. You still have to repackage and submit your React Native app. You can make changes and fix bugs with Turbo Native apps without having to touch on any submission process. Obviously, the exception is if you have a native feature, you need to do a native deploy. But for most part, like your business logic is going to live on your Rails server, and that's the way you want to keep it, and that's the way that it will work best. The downsides, of course, are that Turbo Native is native code, so you need to know Swift and Kotlin. Flutter, you need to know Dart, but nothing else. And React Native, you need a backend and a front end. For a Rails developer, I think it's very obvious that you'd want to go Turbo Native. It's the only one that really works with like this HTML web first approach. But of course, if you're starting from scratch and you want to do an app across 3 platforms and you know some Dart or you're curious about Dart, I wouldn't discourage that. Okay. That was from, okay, Mark Kramer asks that back in August, I mentioned working on the Turbo Native book. That's right. One of the possible topics was native authentication configured with Devise. Can you give any details on what that implementation might look like? I believe I'm going to have to do some digging through my own archives here. Let's see. Okay. So I sent out a newsletter a while back that did native authentication with Devise. I don't have it publicly accessible, so that was kind of like a newsletter bonus here. But what I can show you is the Jumpstart Pro. I'm going to do this in private browsing just to show you that it's public. Jumpstart Pro Rails example app. So there's this project that is, private browsing here, so I don't need any access or anything. Example Turbo Native Rails backend. This is essentially the Rails server that you could run if you were using the Jumpstart Pro iOS or Android app, but you didn't have Jumpstart Pro on your Rails server. It has all the configuration and authentication stuff built in. And what I want to show you here is the Devise stuff. So this is built on native authentication. We're building a native screen, a native page, a native SwiftUI screen or Jetpack Compose. We're sending a JSON request to the server and we're authenticating that user, right? We have 2 things that we need. App controllers, app controllers, Devise controller. This is not relevant. Sorry, don't look at that. Where are we here? API, that's what I was looking for. Okay, auths controller. This is API v1 auths controller. It is what authenticates the user through that JSON request, right? So we're posting up params email password, we're signing in that user, that's part of devise, and we're returning that authentication token on the user. Otherwise, we're returning this JSON error message, status unauthorized. This is from devise. Like you should probably recognize that sign in user will sign in the user on devise. But this is the easy one. The tricky part is that we need to configure devise in a way to work with our app. So here we have our initializer and config initializer's devise. We have two things going on here. The first one is that we remember the user for 1 year. Remembering the user means that the iOS app will persist the session for us indefinitely, essentially. Rails permanent cookies are 2 years, so we could probably change this to 2 years and be okay. That's the first thing we have to set. The second one is that we configure Warden with a Turbo devise failure app. This essentially says when someone doesn't sign in, what logic do we follow? This Turbo devise failure app is, where are we here? App. This devise failure app has one function or method that we care about, respond. If the request is a turbo stream, okay, remember, this is getting called when the user is not authenticated. It accesses a page that we would normally want to redirect to the sign-in page. If it's a turbo stream, we're going to redirect them to the page. If it's a turbo native app, we're going to do HTTP auth. HTTP auth means that we're going to return a 401 from the server. That 401 can then be caught in our native app in the error function to say, okay, this user is no longer signed in. Now we need to do all the cleanup on the iOS app and the Android app to sign them out through native. Those are all the pieces you need to do native authentication on the server. With devise, everything else is sending, JSON requests and gathering email addresses from the client and stuff like that. So I'm not going to dive into that. But I do have an article. If you go to my website, under the articles, there's the hybrid iOS apps with Turbo. And then the last one, number 5 is native authentication. This is still all relevant. It just doesn't deal with, it does deal with devise directly. So you have all of that stuff that I just talked about in this article right here. I'm going to drop in the chat if that will be helpful to you there. Okay, cool. Let me just see if anything is. I'm going to answer this question now because it's relevant. Is it a good idea to go with devise or authentication from scratch as done in daily log, considering we are going to have authentication generator in Rails 8? I think that you should do what works best for you and your team. I was never really a fan of devise, so I was very happy to roll my own. That said, it doesn't handle a lot of the things that you would expect devise to do. It doesn't send confirmation emails. You can't reset your password. I have to do that manually. All the expiring tokens and stuff isn't built in. It's just authentication and session management. So if you are okay with building out all the code on your own, yeah, go for it. It's probably a really fun exercise too. A lot of the security implications are kind of built into Rails now with validate credentials and sending those tokens. To understand, you're assuming some risk versus a battle-tested library like devise. I wouldn't hold my breath that the Rails 8 generator is going to cover every use case that you want. I bet it's going to do something pretty similar to what the daily log authentication does, which is, I think, like 30 lines of code. If I know how DHH and the team works, it's going to be pretty bare bones on purpose to make sure that you can then add on what you need. So this is my entire authentication. We have methods like sign in, sign out, authenticate users that we can call from a controller, and then redirect if authenticated. Otherwise, we can grab the user and check if they're signed in. All the stuff you'd want to expose from device. I really like this. I like having all the code in here. I like one less dependency. If I have to do anything Turbo native related, I can just do it right here. I don't have to figure out how to yield a block to, to devise or a Turbo failure app or anything like that. That said, I don't recommend doing native authentication with Turbo native apps anymore. I think you can get by with WebAuth. You can get like 95% of what you want with WebAuth, web-based, cookie-based auth, for like 5% of the effort. As crazy as that sounds, you can build write very little code. If you look at something like Daily Log, we have a couple controllers here. We have the WebView controller, which is essentially just that bridge copy and pasted from. This is all just for Strata, just to wire up Strata component. And we have a scene delegate, which uses that component. There's nothing about authentication at all in this app, which is really nice. It's all web-based. Okay. So back in August. Okay. Bruno asks, persisting session on iOS. Persisting session on iOS, I'm assuming you mean persisting the web-based session, and I'll show you the one line of code that makes that work. Right here is where we signed the user in on the hand-rolled authentication that I wrote, right? We set current.user to equal to user so we can access it across our app. And then we set cookies encrypted permanent user ID equals user ID. If I open up localhost 3000, I'm already signed in. Excellent. If I go to source storage here, user ID, let's get rid of those. Those are relevant. I have a user ID here, right? With some encrypted value. That's the same right here. That's my user ID encrypted. You'll notice that it expires on February 6, 2025. By expiring it that late and making sure that it's not a session, see how session is unchecked? It means that the iOS app will persist that cookie between app launches. I like to use the cookies.permanent because it's built into Rails. It sets it, I believe, for 2-ish years. Encrypted means that someone can't tamper with it, but that will work across iOS, and it will also work across Turbo Native with some stuff that's built into the Turbo Native library to copy and persist those cookies to disk to behave more like a standard web browser. If I didn't have permanent in here, or if I was using something like session, it would not persist, and when the user closed the app, it would sign you out. So here, we sign in with our user at example.com, password. I click my native Strata button. I'm signed in. I can refresh and go forward and back, right? If I close the app, start the app, you'll see that I am still signed in. All right. If I were to uninstall the app and open up the authentication concern and get rid of permanent, right? So that's what we had commented out. This is what we have now. And we go to sign the user in. I'm still sign in, no problem. We're signed in, right? We can do everything we need to do. But if we close the app, stop it and run it like we did before, I'm no longer signed in. That cookie is no longer, it's only persisted to the session. It doesn't have a long-term date. If I go back to here, you'll see if I delete both of these, it'll sign me out, right? I sign in user at example. Oops. And refresh, because Turbo doesn't refresh it. You'll see that user ID session is now checked. If you don't do .permanent, it becomes a session cookie and just goes away as soon as the session is cleared. On a browser, a session can last, like if I close the tab and reopen it, On iOS, as soon as you close the app, the session ends. So a heads up there that .permanent is all you need if you're rolling your own. Okay, let's see. So I have a question here that's related. Is it useful to use sessions for the web version and cookies only for the native apps? There's definitely some value in keeping those separate. You could do something like, if turbo native app turbo, or like iOS user, right? You could do something like this, and then you actually have them in different spots in your like cookie store, which means that if someone signs out on the iOS app, it wouldn't sign them out on the Rails app, or vice versa. Wait, let me think about that for a second. No, that's not true. Right now, if you, even the way it is, if you sign out on the iOS app, you will remain signed in on the Rails app. If you sign out on the Rails app, you will remain signed in on the iOS app. There's no way here essentially to sign out everywhere because they're just cookies. You'd have to change your whole accessing essentially, right? Because it's only the user ID. If you wanted to sign someone out across different platforms at the same time, you'd need a way to put in something dynamic here that's specific to the browser or to the client or to the user, something like generating a token. And then you could iterate through those and invalidate all of them. But for now, I didn't care about that for this app. Like I said, it's a simple personal logger, so there was no real need to worry about it. Okay. Back in August, we answered that one. We answered persisting session. Marco says hi. Insomniac Digital. How does the styling affect the layout on mobile? So, like I talked about, do I have it open still? Oh, I got rid of it. Maybe if I undo a ton. Oh, nice. We had this question earlier, right? The roadmap. Building the MVP for Rails, to me, means making sure that you have a mobile version. If you don't have a mobile version of your website in Rails working, then you're going to have a hard time converting that to the iOS version or the iOS app or the Android app, right? It's using your mobile views. So you need to make sure that your mobile views look good. So the way that I will do all of this is built with Tailwind, if I recall correctly. Session new. Yep, this is definitely Tailwind. You'll see here, here's a good example. I think that the day show page. Okay, awesome. So this right here is the day show page, right? We have /days and then /the date. And right here, we don't have any button. But if you look at our code, this is the day show page, here's the grid. We have a link to settings that's supposed to show up at the bottom of the page. I can get it to show up by deleting this class. There's the settings button, right? But I have here something called non-turbo native :hidden. What this is a custom variant that I added to my Tailwind config. Down at the bottom here, we have a variant, two variants actually, that let me add turbo native and non-turbo native to do things like this. So this essentially says if you're not a turbo native app, apply the hidden class. We could also do things like turbo native hidden, and it would be the opposite. So now this would show up on our web, but not show up on our turbo native app. This works in conjunction with setting the layout application. We need to make sure we also set data turbo native right here. That's how it follows this. It looks for an HTML tag that has data turbo native and finds this, right, to select that. Otherwise, HTML not. So this platform identifier essentially just says, change forward that, data turbo native for turbo native apps. And we look at that, if turbo native app, oops, platform identifier, right, turbo native, if turbo native app. Otherwise, it's just going to be data, which is fine. So that applies to both. We can hide things. We can even do things like if we look at the day show page, we're rendering out a list, a list header with a button. Here we have the button, right? We can say turbo native BG orange 500 or non-turbo native BG red 900. So if I refresh this, we're going to get red buttons, non-turbo native. And if I refresh this, we're going to get orange buttons. So it's really powerful, and obviously you wouldn't change the color of the buttons on a for a turbo native app if you don't. That'd be weird. But you can start to do all of this Tailwind type styling as if it's just a different variant, a different screen size, and you can combine it with screen sizes too. It gives you a lot of flexibility. I really like that approach. Okay, next question. What do you think about PWA support in Rails 8? Very excited. Very excited for PWA support. A lot of apps don't need to be apps, to be honest. I'm not sold on the fact that it will make products that should be apps work on a PWA just as well. I think that it bridges the gap for products that probably don't really need a mobile app to get by with a couple extra features like push notifications. I think that push notifications is the most important feature of PWAs, and I think that I will be pushing them for sure. But I think that there are still apps that need to be native to have native functionality, like access to the contact book or a lock screen widget to play, pause music, or more intense, more control or grouping notifications, images and notifications that you can't do with a PWA. And for apps that don't need that, websites that don't need that, a PWA is a great option. That said, I am still not convinced. I have still never seen a PWA installed on someone's home screen in the wild. Ever. I have one on my screen because I was playing around with it, but like a non-tech person, I have never seen someone know what PWA means or what a web app even means. So I think there will always be power in you telling your product name to someone and then going to the App Store and typing it in. I was working with a client the other, 2 weeks ago, and they said they wanted an app for the sole reason that their demographic doesn't go on Google. They search the App Store for things. And if you're not in the App Store, it was a fail. It was bizarre to hear, but if that exists at all in some case, I don't think that will ever go away. So I'm all for PWAs. I think they have their place, but I'm still going to be pushing native apps for those products where it makes sense. Hopefully that was helpful. Okay. So we talked about PWA. We have another question here that says, can you guide on how to start with Turbo Native Android if someone doesn't have Mac, so has restrictions to start with Turbo Native iOS? So getting started on Turbo Native Android. Turbo Native Android, it's a great question right now because I actually kicked off a Turbo Native Android app just last night. And the guidelines and README could use a little work. But what worked for me to get started was a combination of two things. If I go to the Turbo Android wiki or Turbo Android website, this is the Turbo Android source code on GitHub, hotwired/Turbo Android. They have a documentation section called Installation, Overview, and Quick Start. I'm going to open Installation and Quick Start and Path Configuration. I followed these steps verbatim here. You actually don't need to worry about this. You can stop. So you only need to do these two things. This caused errors. I didn't use that. I just didn't have it in my Maven central file, or my Maven file, my Gradle file. I replaced the latest version with 7.0.2 like it says here. And I bumped min SDK to 26. I also added this just like it says. And I moved on to the quick start guide and followed all of these steps one by one by one by one by one. And the app crashed for like 2 hours straight. Turns out that the Android app will crash if your path configuration is not valid, which is a little scary. But right here, it tells you to create an asset file path for path configuration and a remote file path. I deleted this and had to create a JSON configuration file that had this exact copy in it. Or sorry, these exact values. If you don't have this, the app will crash because it doesn't know what to do and how to route this URI. I hope that this changes in the near future. I'm going to definitely push for this to be a little bit simpler, but to get started, that is where you want to go. The alternative is that you can download the demo or play with the demo app and use this as your starting point. Keep in mind that it hasn't been updated in a little bit of time, so the Gradle and version and stuff is a slightly out of date for the latest version of Android Studio. That's okay, but it's a really great starting point. Outside of that, WilliamKennedy.Ninja is doing some blog posts and videos on Turbo Native Android. So here is part 3 on authentication client. Here's a video on getting up and running with Turbo Native. So I'll drop I'll drop this in the chat for some Android stuff. I am still writing my book, of course, obviously, otherwise you'd probably be holding it right now. And I'm planning to cover iOS and Android at the same time in one book. So the goal there is that will be the definitive resource on getting started with Turbo Native for both platforms. Okay, next question from Mark here is, I'm working on Turbo Native LMS with students and teachers. Each user type has different navigation needs. How would you go about implementing different tabs based on what user is logged in? That's a great question. Jumpstart Pro Rails and iOS has support for dynamic tabs from the server, right? So if I pop open, what was it? Rails example? Did that find it for me? Let's see if this outlines the path configuration, because it will be helpful to talk about it. It does. So here's the path configuration for iOS that is recommended to work with Jumpstart Pro iOS or Jumpstart Pro iOS. We have the JSON that's rendered out from show. We have the settings key, which has a custom variable called tabs, where we set 3 different tabs. This doesn't do anything on its own. Obviously, there's a lot of logic inside of Jumpstart Pro iOS and Android to parse this and to build out your 5 or 2 or whatever tabs dynamically. This is a really great approach. It has a lot of gotchas and things to watch out for. But with this approach, you can remotely set your tabs from your Rails server. Remember, this is on our Rails backend in a Rails controller. And then when the app launches, it will load this and then load your 5 tabs. A way to do this for your users is a little tricky, though, because when we hit path configurations, we're not actually authenticated. We only hit this endpoint. We don't hit this endpoint with any cookies. We don't hit this endpoint with any authentication or tokens or anything like that. So you would need to build out something that fetched from the server for the current user with a native network request. So that would need to be something like using URL session on iOS to fetch an endpoint, maybe something like /tabs.json that rendered something like this based on the current user, and then that would update the app. It's a lot of work, yes, but if that's something that is required, I think that's not too bad. Alternatively, you could try to use a Strata component. I shy away from a Strata component here because Strata really only wants to map to a single web view. And when you launch the app, you want to see those 5 tabs or 3 tabs immediately versus waiting for a web view to load for then it to render out what tabs you want to do to then reload the 3 pages. So it's like very roundabout to save yourself some code. I know that's not a really good answer for this. I agree. I think that this is something that I don't know if it'll ever make it into Turbo iOS or Turbo Android in the future, but I do think that we are paving the path to make tabs easier to work with Turbo Navigator. So watch that space if anything new comes up with tabs. But for now, you're rolling your own. You're doing a lot of work on your own. Obviously, if you need help there, more hands-on, shoot me an email or drop your email in the chat, and we can talk more about that offline. I've done it before; it's possible, but it's more than I can talk about in a quick screencast like this. Hopefully that was helpful, at least in getting started. Okay, we're going strong here. I'm going to keep busting through some of these questions until we don't have any more. Offline strategies from Clockcatcher 101. No, there's nothing built in. Really bad answer to a really common use case. If your app absolutely requires robust offline access, Turbo Native is not a good choice for you. There are 2 ways to do offline access. You'll notice that like Hey and the calendar both have offline access to certain things. One is to roll your own with native screens. And 2 is to hack, run a local server. They both require, this one is like the recommended approach. This is more of a traditional iOS or traditional Android app. It's essentially build a native screen, build a native endpoint, cache that data locally, and do it all outside of Turbo Native. It requires a lot of work. You're just building an iOS app, but only one screen at that point. Running a local server means embedded in the app itself. What the hell does that mean? I go to the Turbo iOS repo. There's an issue here for offline access that I opened in 2022. And Jay talks about how they proxy their request. Jay from 37 Signals here. He presented on Strata at Rails World. How they proxy their requests through a local server running inside the iOS app. And it was a substantial amount of work. It's not well abstracted and portable. I don't think Jay chimes in anymore after that. I'd recommend looking through this and seeing. It actually was much easier for on Android, which is a surprise. It's usually the other way around. But WebView, WK WebView does not provide APIs to document requests, so for offline access. That's what Hey is using. So when you launch the app, or so when you open an email, it can load your content. For the home screen, though, Hey is entirely offline, which means they launch and load a network request and load JSON and cache it to disk. So when you launch the app, it's offline by default, and then it goes and updates from the server. Again, that's combining these two things. The third and like question mark approach is this. What is it? Turbo cache? This is not going to find. Give me 1 second if I can find this. There's a pull. Oh, is that it? Yeah. Let's see if I can find it here. So there was a pull request for disk cache store, which uses the cache API to retrieve snapshots from the browser cache and was supposed to pave the way for service workers, and eventually the native adapters. That was the goal with this pull request. It was a bit while ago. Like you saw, though, it has been reverted, and there's some hard to debug issues that's going on, and they're pushing for page refreshes for V8, obviously Turbo V8, and this kind of got pushed to the side. My approach with this is that if I have an app that needs offline read and write access, I will push that client towards a fully native app without Turbo. Maybe Turbo native for like the settings screens and configuration and stuff, but you really want to build a fully native app. If they only need offline access, read only to like a screen or two, fully Turbo native with one or two screens to be offline. I have an article on that. Well, I thought I did at least. Huh. Maybe I just like buried it in one of these, but yeah, I thought I wrote an article about what I do for offline app. Oh, you know what it is? No, it must have just been a newsletter. Sorry about that. But I just essentially walked through what I just told you in writing. So if you're looking to do something that's like a single or two screens that have offline access, read only, yeah, go for it. You're going to require a little bit of code, both native on both platforms and some API. I can definitely help you with that if you need more hands-on stuff, but just know that you're in for some code. Okay, so who's next? George Buckley asks, multi-step login, for example, two-factor. Yeah, a bunch of options here, but multi-factor / two-step login. One option is do it all on the web. And it doesn't matter that it's multi-step because your iOS and Android app will just render what pages they're receiving rendering. So that means that if you want to do three-step login or multi-factor or email validation, just do it all on the web and let the client know when it's all done, by sending one URL down the stack. You don't have to worry about if it's a two-step or one-step or three-step. It means that you can handle specific scenarios where like one user has two-factor but one doesn't. So what do you do with that second screen? All that logic lives on the server. Makes it as simple as possible, and you can use cookies to authenticate that user for all of your requests, including API requests. The other approach is that you write a lot of native code. I'm doing this for a client right now that has a two-step login flow, and I just finished the iOS side of it maybe 2 days ago. I wish I had the number of lines, but it was essentially like 8 different classes, 3 different views, and a bunch of different glue code that connected everything to do these 2 screens. Also, there was a lot of validation in place, but you want to avoid that if you can. You also want to avoid it because if your two-step or multi-factor changes in the future, like let's say you move over to passkeys or something, you'd have to release new versions of both apps. Otherwise, those folks can't sign in on your native apps anymore. So my recommendation for authentication now is to do as much as you possibly can on the web. When this falls apart is that you cannot do OAuth, third party, I should say, OAuth without native code or on the web. Apple has a requirement in their review guidelines that if you do any sort of third-party login, you also must do sign-in with Apple. So if you do sign-in with GitHub or sign-in with Google or sign-in with Twitter, you must also show sign-in with Apple, and it must be first. There's also a clause in the developer documentation that if you do sign-in with Apple, it must be native. So if you're doing third-party OAuth, you have to do sign-in with Apple, and if you're doing sign-in with Apple, you have to do it natively. It means that you're creating a lot of code around authentication that you're going to have to write to get into the App Store. You might be able to get by on Android, but on iOS, you're going to have to do it natively. So it's not a great answer. I do know that we have plans for two-factor multi-step login on Jumpstart Pro, iOS, and Android. I know that the Rails side is done. I'm still wrapping up some stuff to work on the iOS side, and Don's working on Android. But I'm hoping that sometime in the next month or so, the Jumpstart Pro templates will include multi-factor auth out of the box, all natively. So if you want to steal some code from that, obviously if you buy the license, or if you want to just use that as is, that's a good way to get started there. Hopefully that was helpful, Mr. Buckley. All right. Where are we? Bruno asks about universal links. Universal links are iOS specific. They let you universal, whoops. Universal links essentially, that's just not a good picture of universal links. Don't look at this. Universal links mean that if I see a link like this, which is, right, the website for this app, and if I click this on my phone, if I have the app installed, it will open the app. And it would, of course, if you could do something like days/2024/01/19, if you open something like this, it would deep link into the app. They're really powerful because they get your user back in the app where you've hopefully created the best experience for them. And they're not that hard to build on Turbo Native apps because of the kind of global routing that exists in Turbo Native. Like, if you got this URL in a fully native app, you'd have to figure out, like, okay, well, a day's show page needs to live off of a day's index page, and we have to do that. We have to fetch the day. So we need to build up these 3 screens just to get here. On Turbo Native, you're like, cool, pretend the user visited this page. Route that URL and show whatever screen that has to be, and you're done. It makes it really easy to deep link into these things, whether it's from a push notification or a universal link or what have you. Getting there, though, is following these guidelines. Universal links for developers. You need to do 2 things. On your website, you need to add this app links JSON file. It goes under like .well-known or something, Apple Site Association file. Do not add a .json extension. It will break it, even though it is JSON. This essentially says, here's your bundle identifier, right? When you visit this page, then route it into the app. So it means that you can start to like allow list or block list different URL paths and say, okay, open all of these into the app. Don't open these into the app. You can do all of this stuff. There's also like wildcards and everything. Once you have this deployed on your server, you then need to configure your iOS app, which is, don't look at the code. We actually don't need to write any code. There's just some configuration we need to add to the entitlement. So we need to add an associated domain entitlement, which essentially says you want to add app links : your domain. So, dailyblog.ing or whatever. This creates that like 2-way binding between your iOS app and your website to show that they work together. And once you have all of that, you'll answer a single question from this right here. Application, continue user activity with restoration handler. This user activity, you can parse out a web page URL and then route that into your Turbo Native app. All of this code down here, you don't need to do any of this. All you need to do is pass that URL into your like routing class or your current page that's being shown. Pretend the user clicked that link, and you're off to the races. This is not supported in daily log, so I don't have a good example of all of this put together. but it is definitely something that I could build out in the future and would, announce it in the newsletter for sure. Hopefully that was helpful. Okay, we answered the question about device authentication or authentication from scratch. Biometrics with authentication, have I ever done biometrics authentication like Touch or Face ID? I have never done integrated with those. What is it? Biometrics. I have never done biometrics in a Turbo native app before. I haven't had a client that needed that level of security is the wrong word, but that needed that. So I haven't worked with it. I can't really comment on the best approach or how to do it because I don't have much experience. I'm trying to figure out if there's a way that I could. I think that you'd have to build out your authentication fully native. Or, okay, so here are some options. Fully native auth, which means you catch when they sign in and ask for biometrics, right? So that you can scan it that first time. The other option is that you lock down the device or the app. So you write a little bit of native code that says when it goes into the background, lock the app. And when the app resumes, you must ask for the user's biometrics. So you're essentially decoupling it entirely from authentication and the Turbo native app itself. You're essentially saying to use this app, you must use your fingerprint. It's not the best approach, but it might be good enough because you wouldn't have to integrate with Turbo native or do any native authentication. That's one way that it could work. I don't have a great answer for that one just because I don't have any experience there, but those are the two approaches that I would try if I were to go down that route. Okay. We talked about sessions for the web version. Jonathan has 180 users on his PWA, and it was a lot of work to get that. That's awesome. Congratulations. I would love to know more, Jonathan, about how you got people to install a PWA. Genuinely, that would be really, really helpful for me. Okay, do you have any recommended resources for learning more about iOS, for being able to build native components and progressively enhance Turbo native apps? So this is iOS resources. And then someone else, I also don't want to copy paste too much and know what's going on, how to fix bugs. Sure. So my favorite resource is hackingwithswift.com. I'll drop this link in the chat. Hackingwithswift.com is super helpful, I think, because if you search for something like biometrics, you get a video, which is usually this video is 9 minutes, some intro text about it, and then some code that you could copy paste if you wanted to. His articles, Paul Hudson, are really specific and to the point. They don't have any fluff. They're pretty dry in a good way, and they're very up to date. You'll see here this one was only updated a few days ago, or maybe almost a month ago. So it's always up to date with the latest version of iOS and stuff. He already has something on Vision iOS, which isn't even out yet. But things like adding user locations to a map, another feature that you'd probably want to do if you have a native app. He doesn't provide all the code that you just say like a chat GPT style, copy and paste this into my app and it works. He provides the building blocks that you need. Very similar how I model my tutorials, actually, in a way that makes it that you learn what you're doing and you're not just copying and pasting. Highly recommend hackingwithswift.com. That's where I go for all of my, iOS type stuff. I found that ChatGPT is extremely useless when it comes to Turbo native. Maybe that's my moat right now as a consultant, but ChatGPT, great. Oh my God. GPT, great for iOS, not so much Turbo Native. I don't know. I don't know if it's like Turbo Native is too new. There's not enough resources on it, but any Turbo Native question I've asked ChatGPT, I've gotten something that's totally unrelated to ChatGPT, or sorry, to Turbo Native. It's been on like a React Turbo Native thing, which is totally not the same. So specific iOS, specific Android questions, it's been really helpful for me as I learn the different platforms. But for Turbo Native, there's really only a few people that are talking about it. Myself, obviously, William Kennedy, whose blog I posted earlier, and also Miles is also talking about it on his blog. He released an app recently, 1500 cows. It's in the App Store. You can download it and play with it. It's awesome. It looks really good. And he's talking a little bit about Strata here, a sneak peek. So definitely check that out as well if you're looking for more resources. Okay, just a few more questions here. Bruno asks if I have a guide to start with this tech. I have a guide that is unfortunately a little bit out of date. I still think that it's helpful. Where are we? So this hybrid iOS apps with Turbo is it hasn't been updated in now, that date is actually, that's wrong, because these dates are more recent. Older. um, this is when I published it. It's not when I last updated it. So I'll get on that. But if you're looking for like a straight up how to get started, this is a great place to go. I'll send a link here. It is a little out of date. It does not talk about Turbo Navigator. It does not talk about Android at all. It assumes you're using a Rails app. It does give you a really good baseline understanding of how to use the framework, though. It's low level. It deals with session. It deals with Turbo. It deals with routing. You're going to not need to know these things in the future when Turbo Navigator is merged in, which is great, but they are important to have the basics. So that's a good place to start. Also, the Turbo iOS repo has an entire section on documentation. Working through this in order from quick start, overview, authentication, blah, 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 will be helpful in learning the lay of the land. It's, again, using session, not Turbo Navigator, but I still think that it's helpful knowledge to have. I think that Turbo iOS and Turbo iOS specifically is in a little bit of like a transition period. It's in like awkward teenage stage right now. And very soon Turbo Navigator will be merged in, meaning that a lot of this, all this code, how many lines of code is this? Too many lines of code, will become this. So way less, way easier to work through, but we're not there yet. We're still working on a branch. So until then, my website, my newsletter, the docs, and William Kennedy and Miles Woodruff. Joshua asks, in our app, we handle Face ID in handling a refresh token. Yeah. Yeah, you can do that if you need to get a refresh token, if you're doing native auth, more traditional OAuth style stuff. If you ever need to get a refresh token, pop open the biometrics to make sure that works, that they're still authenticated. That's a great call. And then we have Bruno thanking it's really important to have a learning path. Yeah, there's a lot of magic. There's definitely, it feels like a lot of magic. I think that Turbo Navigator creates more magic, but in a good way. It's almost like the Rails magic. Now it's a lot of just, what the hell is going on? I recognize that, and that is something that we are, as the maintainers, actively working on. There's something that's really exciting that's coming out in the next few weeks, maybe few months, that I've been working on with the team that I'm really excited to talk about. I can't share anything yet, but it's going to make this journey even easier in the future. So knowing the basics and knowing the underlying tech now for when that comes out, you're going to appreciate it that much more, but you're also going to be one step ahead of the game in getting something that's really awesome working. Insomniac Digital asks if I ever plan on putting a full course together. I do not have any plans on putting a course together, but I am writing a book. I don't have a ton of details to share about release date on that. I am working with a publisher. I am doing iOS and Android in one book. I hope to announce something pretty soon once I nail down the specifics with the publisher, but that will be, I don't know any Android, I don't know any iOS. I need to build an app for both platforms, start to finish. It's going to take you through every step of the way from writing your first line of Swift to your first line of Kotlin to all the way to integrating Turbo to then building out fully native features powered by your Rails app, Strata too. So keep an eye out for that. Newsletter, best places to keep up for updates there. I'll be asking for another round of beta readers soon. So keep an eye. Okay. Another question on what services I use for hosting or deploying my Rails apps. I'm a sucker still for Heroku. It's not the best, but I know it and it's easy for me and it's not the cheapest, but like I know how to use it and I can get something deployed on Heroku in like 30 minutes. I tried Fly, I tried Render, I tried Hatchbox, and I think I'm just being a curmudgeon because I didn't want to learn something new, but I couldn't get them up and running as quickly as I could with a Heroku app. So right now, I have all 6 apps running on Heroku for like a couple $100 a month, and that's fine by me. I could do better, I know, but it's just, I don't care. I don't want to spend my time dealing with deployment and stuff. I'd rather just have it work. So that's why I use Heroku. Um, Appreciate the support. If I were to do a course, I definitely have thought about doing a course. I think that what scares me about a course is that this tech changes so rapidly that recording a lot of video and putting out a course would be out of date like as soon as it's done. Writing a book gives me a little bit more time to let things solidify and release something in a more long term, you know, within the next months instead of in the next weeks. So that's where I'm leaning with the book. Of course, if that all changes and we decide that we've kind of hit solidifying ground, a course or a video course, or whatever, would definitely be possible. But I also, to kind of bridge that gap, I am doing a workshop. So this is a hands-on way of learning Turbo iOS and Turbo Android. That is on my website. You can sign up for notifications when that's live. I don't have the link public, but you can access it if you access it directly. That's a workshop that I usually run every quarter. I'm probably going to do one in February. So if you're interested, drop your email address in there. It'll kind of tag you in my newsletter platform to let you know when it's live. That's usually like 20 people, 2-hour session. It used to be only iOS. We might be doing Android 2 next time, which could be really exciting. So definitely drop your name in there if you're interested. Okay. Best way to learn Java. You don't have to. You can learn Kotlin now, which is great. Learning Kotlin is the Android developer resources. There's a website. This is not it. But if you go to the developer.android.com, there's actually a fairly good walkthrough of building out different Android stuff, building out UI, and they also have a section all on Kotlin, which is what you write your Android code in now. You don't have to use Java if you don't want to. And this is a pretty good walkthrough. I was impressed with how well written this is for something like coming from, like from Google. Talks about compose, and you can actually start a course and like work through a full course. So we definitely recommend checking this out if you're interested in learning some Kotlin there. I have not thought about doing a Facebook group, but I do have a Discord where folks are welcome to join. Let's see if I can. I always have trouble inviting people to Discord, so give me 1 second here while I pull this off to the side and drop an invite code in the chat for anyone who wants to join the Discord. Let's see. Here's a link that never expires. Okay, so that is an invitation to the Discord group. That will drop you right into the Turbo Native Discord channel. We talk about Turbo Native there. I help a lot of folks if they have problems with their Turbo Native integrations and stuff. It's still pretty small. It's only like a couple hundred of us, so you'll definitely get some, hands-on experience working with folks. Okay, I think that might wrap it up for today. I'll give folks just like one more sec to pop any more questions in, and if not, we will wrap up. While I'm doing that, the best place to reach out, again, Mazzolati.com. My email address is right here. You can click that and they'll send an email to me. Obviously, I'm on Twitter as well, but the newsletter is the best place to stay up to date with all this stuff. This is where I'm posting my weekly updates on, Turbo Native findings. I'm hoping to do an Android dive in the next few weeks as I dive into more of that. Last week, obviously, I was announcing this, but the week before that, we talked about the dive into Strata, which was really exciting. A couple thousand people on that list, so definitely come join. I'd love to have you, and I answer every single email when someone responds to one of those. So there you go. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This has been super awesome. I hope you learned something today. Again, newsletter best place, email second to that, otherwise Twitter and the blog. Thank you again, and don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions, ideas for future streams, or have another question that wasn't answered today. Always happy to help. Bye-bye, everyone. We'll talk to you soon.